Since he became president, Donald Trump hasn't just ignored white supremacy and domestic terror. He hasn't just not prioritized it. He's actually gone out of his way to make sure that our government does not have the funds or the manpower to do what's necessary to stop these sorts of attacks from happening. And this information that we're going to talk about today comes from a senior administration official inside of the White House who was working in the areas of counter-terrorism. So Homeland Security officials apparently battled the White House for more than a year to get them to focus more on domestic terrorism. The White House wanted to focus only on the jihadist threat, which, while serious, says the anonymous source, ignored the reality that racial supremacist violence was rising fast here at home. They had major ideological blinders on, as well as racial blinders.
Yeah, can I just interrupt for a second? Because I don't think it's ideological blinders. It's not that they can't see it. They see it, they just don't really want to combat it because they think it's their base. So it's way worse than ideological blinders. And in fact, as you'll see a little bit later here, these sources are not remotely progressive.
No.
They're just like, this is our job. We're supposed to fight extremists, otherwise they kill everybody. Should we not do that? That's weird.
So let me give you some more information from this source. That former senior administration official noted that the White House, especially the president, have a problem criticizing white supremacy. And so there was this attempt to get a brief mention of domestic terrorism into the national counterterrorism strategy. He said of that, they didn't have the expectation that the White House or Trump would get behind it because the preponderance of it involves white supremacy. And that's not something the administration is comfortable speaking out against until the other day by the president earlier this week. And even that was pretty hedged. And then there's a sentence, which is just, it should be a national tragedy itself that it could be written and be true. During a lengthy back and forth, the senior source tells CNN, one White House official proposed that the national counterterrorism strategy focus on radical Islamists and foreign drug dealers, since that would please the president, which, as we all know, is what the national counterterrorism strategy is written for.
To please the president, yes. This source that CNN talked to said the last administration was too politically cautious in calling out the threat of Islamist terrorism, but that doesn't mean we need to overcorrect and ignore what was surging domestic threat. So obviously they're not anybody's liberal. So no progressive thought, oh, the last administration is soft on Islamist terrorism, right? So this is a conservative person, fairly clearly, and says, but why? Because I'm conservative and I thought we should have gone after Islamic terrorism more and called it by its name and et cetera, and those talking points that you hear. That doesn't mean we shouldn't go after white supremacists who are killing people, does it? And that's the negotiation they had. They had to have a negotiation with the White House. They're like, we're law enforcement. Can we pretty please do our job? And they're like, I don't know. So the way they resolved it is what they snuck in just one phrase. And into their report so they could use it as an excuse to actually do their job. So I'll read that to you guys. So ultimately, the White House added just one paragraph about domestic terrorism as a throwaway line. This is what the senior source says. And that paragraph mentions, quote, other forms of violent extremism, such as racially motivated extremism, that's the only phrase, that's it. Then adds animal rights extremism, environmental extremism, sovereign citizen extremism, and militia extremism. So even yeah, that's true. They had add at least the militia and the sovereign citizens, et cetera. But even in the one sentence we got, it was divided equally between right-wing extremists and theoretical left-wing extremists. I say theoretical because where are they, right? I remember when the left-wing extremists shot up a whole town? Yeah, neither do I.
Cenk, this morning on the damage report, I had an animal rights activist on who's facing 8 felony charges for attempting to free ducklings from a factory farm.
Yeah, it's up in Petaluma.
That's a radical. Yeah. Same as a white supremacist.
It's the
who kills 22 people.
And it's the equivalent of that they're good people on both sides kind of play, right? In other words, we're looking for white supremacy, extremism, and but we're also looking equally at these other things, animal activists and the like. It's disgusting on a couple of different levels, one of which is you need these briefings, you need these strategies to be unfiltered. You need them to reflect the reality. I mean, we're dealing with serious threats to the nation and to people's well-being. And you can't afford to have them A, watered down, and B, altered to kiss the president's ass, which is really what's going on. Yeah. And you'll remember, we're not allowed, I say we, just as a nation, to bring up in the form of any of the officials who are charged with election security, the notion that there might be foreign involvement in our election. Yeah. Why? Because the president doesn't want to hear about it, and it challenges the legitimacy of his presidency. So, in other words, there are already a bunch of filters on the information that's coming into the Oval Office, and this is a really serious problem. You wouldn't. I have to. Last thing, I always thought, well, everybody knows Donald Trump is really not that bright, and so they're not going to pay too much attention to what he says. They're kind of going to do their own thing. There was that New York Times op-ed piece about, hey, don't worry, we've got our hands on the wheel. We give him a fake wheel to steer the car. But now we're realizing that no, what's actually happening is the intelligence community and many around the White House are bending information and bending policy to please the president.
And in this case, at least even the conservatives within the Department of Homeland Security were like, let's just get them to agree to blame the ducklings too, but sneak in the words so that at least we'll have some fig leaf to actually do our jobs, to go and make sure that they don't kill American citizens, right? So credit to the guys at the Department of Homeland Security, no matter what their politics is, that at least they're trying really hard to do the fake steering wheel and have an excuse. But if they couldn't put that in, then their hands would be tied. They literally couldn't do anything. They'd have to leave it to local law enforcement after the fact, et cetera. So to that point, I actually want to mention two other things. One, remember FBI Director Chris Wray came and testified in front of Congress and said that the majority of people that they're arresting for domestic terrorism is right-wing extremists. But it's actually a bare majority. So they're still arresting plenty of Islamic extremists in the country. But then that made me think about it. On the other hand, so those are the arrests. But we know, the ADL did a study of last year, 98% of all the killings were done by right-wing extremists. What does that tell you? That means they got almost all the Islamic extremists that might have done something in the country, the FBI, and great credit to them for wonderful law enforcement there. Yeah. But they didn't get all the right-wing extremists because they didn't have enough resources, they didn't have enough of a team, they didn't have enough of a budget. And since those guys made it through and weren't caught by law enforcement, they massacred a lot of people. And yes.
And really fast, I want to demonstrate how perhaps we ended up in a situation where they're not going to track down those people. So really fast, I want to take you back to May 2017, the Joint Intelligence Bulletin titled "White Supremacist Extremism Poses Persistent Threat of Lethal Violence." So this was relatively early on in the Trump administration, so they were still allowed to publish things like that. But it might have been a bad idea because in that they talk about how serious white supremacist extremists are. If we could bring up the next graphic, you're gonna see that they break down all of the different homicides that have been committed by white supremacist extremists, talk specifically about the threat that firearms in their hands could pose. But it seems in hindsight to have been a bad idea to even put it on the Trump administration's radar, because less than a full month after that, the Department of Homeland Security cut grant funding to previously approved applicants whose focus was on studying extremists' online networks and helping both white supremacists and Muslim extremists leave their movements. So these organizations had already been around, they'd already been vetted by the federal government, they'd already been receiving funding that was cut right after a government report saying this is a serious problem and we need to take it seriously.
Well, speaking of funding, to give you a sense of how bad this situation is, the source says the reality is that there won't be a fiscal year 2020 budget for the department, so they'll have to make do. So they don't have the money to actually, even if they had the inclination, and it sounds like they do, no matter what their politics, at the lower levels at the Department of Homeland Security, not at the political levels. They want to do their job, but they don't have a budget for it. And then finally, I also want to criticize Democrats, because Daryl Johnson, who was conservative again within the Department of Homeland Security, who worked on this issue during the Bush administration, led a team that came out with a report saying the right-wing extremists are coming. They were a small movement before, but it looks like Obama might win, and if he does, it's going to get much larger. We need to focus on it. That report written in the Bush administration gets released during the Obama administration. They yell at Obama. And honestly, Obama and the Democrats cowered, and they shut that department down, and they eventually fired Daryl Johnson. It was the Obama team that did that. And Daryl Johnson says, I was a conservative. I was a goody two-shoes Boy Scout Mormon. He's like, I was against gay marriage. I was as conservative as it gets. And so when they fire my team and eventually I go, that sends a message to everybody. Do not, under any circumstances, go after right-wing extremism. Because if you do, there'll be a price to pay.
Yeah.
So the Democrats in their cowardice and the Republicans in their viciousness led to this. And Daryl Johnson says, the Republicans, he's now not a Republican anymore after all this. He said, look, I saw them with my own eyes fight against law enforcement over and over again. And I couldn't take it anymore. And he said, at this point, they have blood on their hands. Well, hey, you made it this far. You must really like the Young Turks. Thank you, we really appreciate you. Now, another easy way to keep supporting us also helps keep your internet activities and data private, all with a push of the NordVPN app. Head to nordvpn.com/TYT right now for 75% off of your next 3 years.